I am also a research assistant for the economics faculty here at Purdue Northwest, and this is another project done with the Purdue Northwest faculty as an undergraduate research assistant. Today's presentation will be on the impacts of city income and education inequality on school district educational outcomes. This is a Northwest Indiana case study. So we will be focusing in on Northwest Indiana, the region, as well as data from Northwest Indiana. Just to give you an outline of today's presentation, first I will be going over background of the case study area of Northwest Indiana, as well as introducing the problem and significance for today's presentation, which will be motivated by past research. Then I will outline the methodology for my research as well as the results. Finally, I will conclude with study limitations that I came across with, as well as some future research directions. So, background on the study area. Like I said, today's presentation will focus in on Northwest Indiana. This is defined as the region of the 7 counties: Lake, Porter, LaPorte, Stark, Pulaski, Jasper, and Newton. Within this region, 53 cities were identified, as well as their respected school districts. Northwest Indiana actually represents a region with a mix of urban and rural cities, with varying levels of income, education, race and ethnicity backgrounds, as well as also developed alongside many important economic powerhouses, such as the industrialized shore of Lake Michigan, and of course, the city of Chicago. With this, I collected data on the 53 cities and their respected school districts for 2017 and 2016. The sources of this data is coming from the American Community Survey census data and the Indiana Department of Education using the school years 2016 to 2017 and 2017 to 2018. Next, I will be going over some of the data found on Northwest Indiana and give an overview of the variation in income and education in Northwest Indiana. Here on the left, we have the city mean income. We have a chart here to help display the variation happening in this map, displaying the cities in Northwest Indiana by zip code. This is also data coming from 2017. On the right, we have the percentage of households who reportedly had income less than $35,000 in 2017 by city once again. As you can see, there is definitely variation occurring in the city income. One reoccurring pattern that we will notice in many of the maps when we look at the educational outcomes is that we're seeing clusters of low income as well as low educational outcomes in the more rural counties of Newton, Jasper, Pulaski, Stark, and LaPorte, as well as the northern region of Lake County. And here as well, you can see high density of percentage of low income households. Same thing alongside these counties. Next, we will be looking at education gaps in Northwest Indiana, focusing in on the percentage of the population in that city that obtained a bachelor's degree or higher in 2017. Once again, we're seeing the similar pattern of these rural counties having lower educational outcome, and then as well in the northern region of Lake County. We're seeing changes from 72% of the population having a bachelor's degree located in this tiny city here in Porter, as well as low as 1.3% in Kingsbury, LaPorte, a very rural community, with an overall average of 17%, where in Lake and Porter County, we're seeing higher percentages, where in these counties, we're seeing very, very low. Now we're focusing in on educational outcomes at the school district level. On the left, we have ISTEP 10, which represents the standardized test taken in grade 10. And this also represents the percentage of students within that school district who passed for the school year 2017 to 2018. And on the right, we have the graduation rates. There's a lot more variation when it comes to standardized test scores than compared to graduation rates. Typically, when it comes to graduation rates, most cities and school districts were reporting at 100% or near 100%, as you can see by the darker shaded regions. We do have some extreme variation where in a city such as East Chicago, we're seeing it as low as 60%. And then the variation, of course, in standardized test scores is also just as large, where we have a high of 60% of the students passing the standardized tests and as low as 99.4% in Hammond of Lake County. The Indiana average, which was reported by the Department of Education, sits at 33% of students passing the standardized test, where the overall average of Northwest Indiana is sitting at about 30%. So overall, the cities in Northwest Indiana and the school districts are arguably underperforming when it comes to standardized test scores. When it comes to graduation rates, though, fortunately, we do see an above average in comparison to the Indiana average. So that brings us to the problem. Income and education gaps exist in Northwest Indiana. And that leads us to the questions. Why is income education varying in Northwest Indiana? What is its impact, and which factors are contributing to the gap, specifically at the school district level? Past research demonstrates the relationship between the two inequalities as well as the negative impacts. Studies highlight that income and education inequality, both large measures of it and increased measures of it, led to decreased economic growth and increased poverty rates within a region. Also, furthermore, income and education impact each other in a circular relationship, where income impacts education and education further impacts income. For example, a student coming from a lower income household is more statistically likely to result in lower educational outcomes. With that lower educational outcome, they're more statistically likely to have, of course, lower wages. And this cycle then continues in a circular fashion. Other studies identified these negative impacts and this relationship and wanted to focus on a solution. They focused in on the educational outcome at the secondary school level, which is like high school. And this is because this represents a group of the population who is still gaining their education, as well as represent the future human capital. What they did was look at what demographic and socioeconomic variables were causing the change in educational outcome. So that brings us to the solution. To address the income and education inequalities in Northwest Indiana, we should try to focus on raising the educational outcomes of the lowest educated regions. By doing so, we reduce gaps in educational outcomes and potentially reduce income inequality in the long term. To do so, we must identify the gaps in low income and education, which we did previously looking at the maps and data. And then we must estimate what factors are contributing to this variation in educational outcome. To do so, like I said, I collected the data on socioeconomic and demographic variables. And then I performed a multiple linear regression. This is then to estimate the impacts of these variables on educational outcome. A multiple linear regression is a statistical technique that we can use to understand how certain factors are impacting another factor, also known as the dependent variable. The factors impacting the dependent variable are also known as explanatory variables. The dependent variable in our case is, of course, educational outcome. In these models, we will be using two different measures for educational outcomes. This is because on previous studies, they definitely noticed differences when using either standardized test scores or graduation rates. So we'll just be using both measures to try to highlight any maybe interesting differences in the two. So for standardized test scores, we will be using ISTEP 10, which represents the percentage of students who pass the Indiana standardized test, also called ISTEP, in grade 10. And of course, graduation rates represents the percentage of students who graduated the 12th grade in that school district. Our explanatory variables, the variables that we expect to be impacting the educational outcomes, standardized tests, and graduation rates, are socioeconomic and demographic variables, further defined into two categories: city characteristics and the school district characteristics. By using school district characteristics, we're trying to capture the impact of the school inputs and school enrollment on the educational outcome. City characteristics is further capturing the overall city and neighborhood's impact on these outcomes. For socioeconomic variables on the city side, we have things such as percentage rural, household income with less than 35,000, percentage of the population with bachelor's degree or higher. On the school district side, we have free reduced lunch enrollment, which is a program for low-income students. When it comes to demographic variables, we had things such as single-parent households, race and ethnicity, disability, and percentage of population who spoke English less than very well. Similar for school districts, we had similar demographic variables. One important factor that needs to be considered when doing multiple linear regression is that your explanatory variables cannot be simultaneously impacting each other. They can only be impacting the dependent variable. So ultimately, a lot of these variables, of course, are impacting each other, which another term for that is correlation. So because of this, multiple models were created, and ultimately some variables such as race and ethnicity and single parent household and free reduced lunch had to be completely excluded due to their high correlation with almost all the other variables. So our resulting models, which we are trying to estimate how city and school district characteristics are changing educational outcome at the city level. We have 4 different models, 2 for the standardized test measure and 2 for graduation rates. In our first model, we have standardized test scores as a result of the special education enrollment, the English learner enrollment, the percentage of the city that was rural, and the percentage of the city population that had a bachelor's degree or higher. In the second equation, since bachelor's degree or higher was highly correlated with the household income, we then of course swap that out to then test for the income variable of household income less than 35,000. Similar with graduation rates, we have the same 2 equations. Next, this is the results of the regression analysis summarized. On the left here, we have the equations for our dependent variable ISTEP 10, standardized test scores. And here on the right, we have graduation rates. Here, this first column represents the variables, our explanatory variables, which we expect to be changing the percentage of students passing ISTEP 10. And the second column here represents the coefficients. And what the coefficients tell us is how education is changing the percentage of students passing ISTEP 10. So what this tells us, since we have a negative coefficient, is that as student education enrollment increases, we're seeing a decrease in the percentage of students passing ISTEP 10. The second column here represents the significance level, which is basically a statistical test which helps us validate the results we're getting in our estimations. In this case, it tells us that the significance level was non-significant. So we don't have enough evidence to say that special education is indeed impacting the standardized test outcomes. Here, I just summarized all the results from the tables into an easy to read and interpret table. And now we'll just discuss some of the key results that came out of it. So some of those key results, of course, are both educational outcome measures, graduation rates, and standardized test scores were negatively impacted by the percentage of English learners and percentage of low-income households, meaning the more we had of English learners or low-income households, the lower graduation rates and lower percentages of standardized test scores passed we saw. When it came to the special education enrollments, this was only observed to be significant in decreasing graduation rates, where standardized test scores are not affected by special education enrollments. For our education variable, the bachelor's degree or higher, this city variable was observed to only be improving the standardized test scores, but not graduation rates. In terms of the rural percentage of the areas that's rural, this was also observed to only impact the standardized test scores. So students coming from more rural communities are more likely to have school districts from rural communities are more likely to have lower percentages of students passing their ISTEP 10. So finally, with this regression analysis, there is of course many limitations and many future research directions that can be taken. For limitations, there is certainly many data limitations. Unfortunately, I was limited to only aggregate level data of city and school district variables. It would be a lot more better to estimate the impacts of individual student level data, but unfortunately that's not available. Another key important factor is the school district inputs, such as teacher salary, student-teacher ratio, and expenditure. Unfortunately, this was not available for multiple years, so was also excluded from the final models. For future research directions, there's many further statistical techniques that can be used to improve these estimations. When it came to our dependent variables, there's ways around that to bring them back and include them into our estimations using models such as instrumental variable approaches and fixed effect models. There's also further more advanced techniques for modeling such as interaction terms. Sometimes one of our explanatory variables alone is not explaining the educational outcome, but more of a combination of two factors, and that's where interaction terms can come in. And there's also non-parametric estimations for nonlinear relationships, where in a linear regression, we're assuming a constant linear relationship where we could have an exponential growth or de-exponential growth. So with that being said, in conclusion, based off of the previous research cited previously, income and education inequality definitely has a negative impact and negatively impacts Northwest Indiana in terms of economic growth and potentially increased poverty rates. Also, Northwest Indiana definitely has some gaps in income and education, with clusters of lower income and education in the northern region of Lake County, as well as the southern rural communities. Northwest Indiana data sample shows that the variation in educational outcome is significantly explained by the percentage of English learner enrollments, as well as the percentage of low-income households. When it came to standardized test scores, this was more significantly impacted by the city's education level, where graduation rates was exclusively influenced by the special education enrollments. With this in mind, public policy can be formulated considering these relationships and impacts and focusing in on these low-performing regions, reducing the education gaps by addressing these factors that are causing reductions in educational outcome. For example, since English learner enrollment was a definite significant variable in both educational outcomes, maybe public policy could focus in on programs that support students who are learning English, for example, or maybe more support towards low-income areas, of course. But with that being said, that concludes today's presentation. Here are some of the references that I was mentioning in the previous slides, but ultimately I would like to open up the floor to any questions, recommendations, comments. And also, if you're interested in this PowerPoint or any of the references listed here, you can of course email me at croon@pnw.edu.